Good morning, YouTube, and welcome back to the channel. I've got a bit of a long one for you today, but I promise it's worth it. We're going to be making this beautiful walnut frame here, and we're going to be float mounting this absolutely gorgeous image. Now, I wish I could say this was one of my images, but it is not. This belongs to Joe Ondrako. You may know him as the blueberry that walks through my compositions, but he's also a fantastically talented landscape photographer. Now, all we'll be doing today is building the frame and then getting the image mounted into it. I won't be covering the printing, the float mounting, any of that. We'll be doing that all in future videos. Today's video is all about turning a single gorgeous piece of walnut into an even more beautiful work of art. I hope you'll stick around. Let's get into it. Okay, well, this is the board that we're going to be working with today. It is 8/4 walnut, which means it is just shy of 2 inches thick. It's about 1 7/8 inches thick, and it is just over 10 inches wide and 8 feet long. Now, I'm gonna be ripping this down into 1 7/8 inch strips today, and that's what we'll be making the frame out of. And the reason I chose 1 7/8 inches, because the kerf of the saw blade is 1/8, so each strip will be about 2 inches when you account for that waste, meaning I'll get 5 strips out of this one board, which means I should be able to make 2 frames out of it, if not a third smaller frame. So that's the plan. Now, I applied some mineral spirits to it, and I showed this board and another board to the client and asked him to choose which one he prefers, and he selected this one. Now, I don't blame him, because the grain is absolutely beautiful and there's a nice rich texture and color in this board. It would have been my first choice between the two boards as well. The downside is, when I was at the mill, I had this surfaced, which means they run it through a machine, they take the rough wood, and they give you perfectly smooth sides. So you have S2S, which means the two faces are perfectly parallel to each other. S3S means they surface one edge, and then of course S4S means you have all 4 perfectly edged faces. Now, I'm usually a cheap ass. I usually only pay for them to surface 2 sides, and then I do the third side, the edge on my jointer when I get home. This time I opted to pay the extra 30 cents a board foot and have them do 3 faces, and I'm very lucky I did, because this board has developed a bit of a bow here in the center. It's about 3/8 at the center, which means I'm gonna have to rip it down on the table saw and then joint the face anyway to remove that bow. So by the time it's all said and done, I'll probably end up closer to 1.5 inch thick rather than the 1 7/8. If I didn't have this edge here surfaced, it would be a lot more difficult on the table saw to cut a clean edge. So fortunately, it'll be something that I could fix. It's just a little bit more work. So I'm gonna go ahead and start there over on the table saw, getting it ripped down to size. Okay, so now we have our 4 strips here. The 5th strip has a chunk on the bottom that's missing, so I removed that one. And because the frame that we're making today is just about 4 feet by 3 feet, I'm gonna be able to make a single frame out of 2 strips. Now, every time I'm making a frame, I try and make it from a single board. And the reason is because just because boards are within the same species doesn't mean they're gonna go well together. You have tons of variation in the grain and the color of the wood, and making a frame from a single board means that they're gonna go well together. Now, nothing distracts me more than looking at a mismatched frame where the grain doesn't meet up in the corners and it just looks weird. So what I like to do is end one corner where the other one's gonna start. And what I mean by that is, like I said, today's frame is gonna be roughly 4 feet by 3 feet. So each strip is gonna give me a 4 foot and a 3 foot. And that means that when I cut my miters, where that one ends, the other one is gonna wrap and start. And that's gonna make sure that the grain is gonna line up. It's never gonna be 100% perfect, but it's going to be much better, because in this piece of wood we have a bunch of wavy grain towards the center, and then it straightens out at the edge. So if I were to try and align one of these wavy portions with one of the straight portions, it's going to look off. So what I'll do is 4 feet and 3 feet on a single strip, and then the next strip is going to go 4 feet and 3 feet in this direction, And that's gonna make sure that all my corners are gonna line up with their corresponding partner. So now what I'm doing is I'm just looking at the 4 pieces and deciding which are gonna be the better for this frame. And I think I'm gonna end up choosing this one. And that's because it has a lot of this beautiful wavy texture in the center, and then all of the edges are nice, long, straight grain. And that's gonna mean that the center focal points are gonna have the most character and texture, and then it's gonna be very easy to match up those corners. So I'm gonna go ahead and select these two. These two I'll save for a project later, and I'm not gonna surface them today, because by the time I go to use them, they might be warped again.
Now as I pass this through the jointer, you'll hear that at the beginning and the end of the cut, you can hear wood actually being removed, and as I pass through the middle, nothing is happening. And that's because there's that bow in the middle. So with each pass, I get closer and closer to removing that bow, and I know that I'm done when I hear cutting all the way through, and that's when I bring it over to the table to make sure it's completely flat. Now because at the jointer I'm removing material from the ends more than the center, afterwards I have to go to the table saw and remove that thickness from the center to even up the board. And I use the table saw so that I end up with usable scraps instead of a bunch of expensive sawdust.
Okay, so I just replaced the saw blade on my table saw, so it actually cut beautifully. Minimal saw marks, they'll come off when I do my first sanding, so not terribly worried about it. So I'm not gonna mess with the thickness planer, I think we could skip that. What I have now are 2 pieces that are perfectly even on all edges, and I have to say this is a beautiful board. I cannot wait to get it sanded down and put some finish on. But before we do that, I have to move on to cutting the rabbet. Now, what Joe wanted was, he wanted the face, which is going to be facing the viewer, to be the thicker part. So what we're going to have is basically this 1 3/8 standoff from the wall, and then we're going to have about a 2-inch face, which I think is going to be a nice aspect ratio given the size of the print. I would usually do a 3-inch, but Joe felt that he wanted one a little bit thinner, and I think with this board it's going to work out just beautifully. So what I need to do now is I need to cut the rabbet, and I'm going to do that over on the table saw as well, again, so that I minimize the waste of the board. And the rabbet that I'm going to be doing is going to be 3/8 in. And in terms of the depth of the rabbet, I'm working with a 1/2-inch substrate, and then I'm going to be applying a backer board just to protect it and make it look finished. And that's going to be about 1/8. And then I want to give myself enough room for the fasteners to have teeth to bite in, so I'm going to add 1/8 on top of that. So in total, we're looking at a depth of 3/4 of an inch, and then again 3/8 in. So what I will do is just make 2 passes on the table saw, and that's going to give me a nice clean rabbet. So I'll go ahead and take you over to the table saw and show you how I do that. Okay, so when I set this up, it's always helpful for me to have a visual aid. And since we're working with 8-foot boards, it's just much easier to use a small scrap. Now, this is where it's very easy to screw up. So what I want to do is I want to make sure that my fence is offset by as much as I need for the rabbet minus 1/8, because the thickness of my blade is going to be 1/8 of an inch. So I need to account for that. So because I want my rabbet to be 3/8 in, I'm going to mark it at 1/4. And then what I should have is a distance from the fence of 3/8. And I'm 3/8 inches in. Now I need to set the height, which again is going to be 3/4. So I do the same thing. I set my gauge to 3/4 of an inch. Lock it down. I put it, get the tooth at the highest, and then I'm just going to lower the blade just until it touches. And so when I'm at the right height, I should be able to spin the blade and it should just touch the bottom. Okay, so before I even go to the table saw, this is very important. I need to lay my boards together and make sure that I have them correct. Now, we talked about in the beginning wanting to have a cohesive grain pattern, and that's exactly what I'm doing now, is I'm looking at the boards and making sure that the grain is aligned, because when I cut my rabbet, it's going to force me into a position where I might not be able to line that grain if I cut the rabbet the wrong way on the boards. Now, I should have marked my boards before I even started. That would have been the intelligent thing to do. I didn't do it, so now I have to put this little puzzle back together. And there it is. Okay, so this is the correct orientation of the boards. Now I just have to decide which part I want to be facing the viewer. And as you can see, this side here has this light wood coming through, which in a lot of projects I think could be beautiful, but for a picture frame, I don't want that, because what's gonna happen is you're gonna have this strip of light grain on either the top or the side and nowhere else, and that's gonna be distracting. So we want this to be facing away from the viewer, meaning that this is gonna be the front of the frame, and you can see we just have this beautiful consistent color and this excellent grain texture here. So because this will be facing the viewer, now I have to determine where my cutouts are going to be. And you can see this side also has this light mark that I've marked to make sure I didn't miss. So I think what's going to end up happening is the orientation of the frame is going to have this on the top so that it's out of view, meaning this is going to be the face, these are going to be the outer edges, and then this is going to be the inside. And you can see we have that same light color here. So I want to make sure I cut away this section. So this pencil line is just a visual cue for me to know what's supposed to go away. And again, we have that same light pattern here. Okay, so now we're all set. I'm going to take them over to the table saw and go ahead and make our cuts.
What I forgot to mention when I was filming this piece is that when you're making your cutaway for the rabbet, you're going to want to make sure that the piece that's being cut away is not going to be wedged between the blade and the fence. Otherwise, it'll kick back at you, and that's definitely not what you want. So you'll see here as I push away, the piece is just left behind, and it's not wedged between the blade and the fence.
Okay, so this is going to be difficult to show you, but the dimensions that we need are 48 1/8 by 32 3/8. And if you're thinking that sounds like a made-up aspect ratio, it's because it is. Joe's a bit of a pain in the ass, but what I've done is I went through the board, and it's going to be very hard to show you this because I did it with pencil, but I just tentatively marked where my long and short pieces are going to be on each board, and then the direction of the miter. And those are just visual cues for me to make sure I don't accidentally cut in the wrong direction. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to start on the ends, cut that first miter because the length isn't critical there, and then I'm going to measure, transfer the line, and cut the piece back around. And now all that's going to be left to do is line up my cut so that the inside of this line lands on the inside of the sacrificial fence. And I'm going to cut a little bit heavy because then I can trim it down using my miter trimmer. So although I have a fresh blade on my miter saw, the saw that I have is not exactly a precision machine, and rather than constantly fussing with it to try and get perfect angles, I always just leave a little bit heavy and then come over to this miter trimmer where I trim down the last little bit. And the key with this is just to take small slivers at a time until the wood is sitting completely flush with the inside of the blade. All right, here we have our pieces cut. Now, what I always like to do is make sure that they're perfect, because the key to getting perfect miters is making sure that you're going to have 4 perfectly parallel sides. So I like to line them up edge to edge and make sure that all the points come to a perfect alignment. And then before we go any further, I like to dry fit all of my corners. And to do this, I lay the frame upside down and have to figure out which piece goes where. There we go. And then I just lay them out, taking a 90-degree angle, going all the way around and making sure that once they're clamped up, we're going to have perfect edges. And then the final step before we get ready for glue up is sanding. And that is the worst. I'm not going to make you watch that entire thing, but my progression when I'm sanding is I use an 80 grit and then a 120 and then a 180. And then I do all of my sanding when the pieces are separate, because it's a lot easier to make sure that I get much cleaner edges. And then additionally, what I don't want to do is wait until my boards are secured to be sanding, because then you risk going across the grain in your corners, and that's going to give you swirl marks and cuts on your edges. So what I do is I do my progression of 80, 120, 180, using mineral spirits in between to clean the boards. And then after glue up, what I'll do is I will tape the corners and do a really quick 220 grit just to remove any glue adhesive or anything that I missed on the edges. And then I will go ahead and apply my finish. But for now, I'm gonna go ahead, break out the sander, and go ahead and get these sanded down.
I used a random orbital sander to sand the face and back edge, but for the thinner edge, I go ahead and use a sanding block and hand sand it. Additionally, the reason I use mineral spirits instead of water to remove the dust is although water would raise the grain and give you a smoother finish, it also risks adding water to the board, which could cause warping. And we worked really hard to get these flat, so I stick with mineral spirits and avoid that risk.
Okay, well, after about an hour and a half worth of sanding, I finally have my pieces ready to go. The next step is that I'm going to be using the Domino to throw a domino in each corner, and then of course we'll do our glue up. Now, I wanted to really quickly talk, because we'll be doing splines in a future video, as I mentioned. To me, when I use splines, they're more of a design element rather than a structural thing. Splines do add a great deal of strength. Glue joints really aren't very strong on their own, gluing to end grain. But dominoes or dowels are much stronger. So to me, I'll usually use domino if I can, and if it's a thin frame, I'll use a dowel. And then I'll add splines really if I feel it's a good design element. In this case, we're not going to be using splines. I'll just be doing the dominoes. So what I'm going to do now is cut one domino in each corner and then get it ready for glue up.
I'll eventually need to do an entire video on using dominoes in frames, but essentially what I'm doing here is just going around the frame, holding the two pieces exactly where they need to be during the glue up and marking a line across the two boards. And this is to ensure that we're going to have perfect alignment. And this is just a scrap piece to show you, once I have my pencil mark here on the edge, it's as simple as lining up that pencil mark with the index on the domino, clamping it in place, and cutting the piece. Before I install the dominoes and do my dry fit, I like to trim them down using this plate, and you simply tap them in with a mallet and then press them through. And what that's going to do is shave off the ridges so that you can easily install and remove them. And this is very helpful when I'm doing the frame, because what I don't want to do is put it together and then find out something needs to be adjusted and then I can't get the domino out. So having this little bit of slack makes it much easier to do the dry fit, and it gives me a little bit more flexibility when I'm going to do the glue and clamping.
Okay, so I put the dominoes in all four corners of the short ends just to make it easier to figure out what goes where. And now I'm just dry fitting. And what I want to see is when I put in the domino, are we getting perfect corners? We should be. And if not, why? Okay, so once I get one corner, I'll just clamp it down, and then that's going to be our reference, and the rest should be pretty easy. Now, the reason I do this dry fit is I want to make sure this is really kind of my last chance to check everything. And of course, it's not going to fit 100% perfect, because every time you move one corner, the other ones are going to shift. But I go from corner to corner while the domino is in place, because I want to make sure that when I go to clamp, I can clamp a perfect corner. So I check my miter, I check the inside corner, and then I move on to the next one. And because of the clamping pressure that I'm going to be applying, I'll be able to correct any very minor imperfections, but I want to make sure that if there's anything glaring, I'm fixing it now before I apply glue. And these corners all look very good. So I think we're ready to start our glue up.
This video is getting a bit long. You don't need to have me explain glue. The only things I want to point out here is that I do apply blue painter's tape to all of my mitered corners. And I'm going to clean up with mineral spirits after, but this does help me remove a bunch of the glue squeeze out that I'm going to have, and it just makes the cleanup a lot easier and minimizes any sanding I have to do on those corners, because it's very difficult to sand those corners after the glue up.
Now while I'm applying the pressure with the clamp, I'm using my fingers to feel the joint, and I'm checking all of my edges. I want to make sure that this is a nice clean edge and that everything is staying aligned. So you can see here it's nice and smooth. And that's what we're looking for. Check my inside seam, it's nice and tight. Move on to the next corner, and then I'll let this set up.
And then afterwards, this is what you should be left with: a nice clean miter and a tiny bit of glue residue that I'll clean up with mineral spirits as we get ready for finish.
Okay, so I've got the frame elevated off the workbench now because that helps me to look for any spots. As I apply mineral spirits, I go all the way around the frame, and I use an angled flashlight, just looking for any imperfections that need to be sanded out or smooth. Now we're finally ready for the finish. This is the part that makes me love doing this. Sanding sucks. Honestly, all of it is work, but applying the finish is the reward, especially when you're working with a beautiful piece of walnut like this. So I am really excited. We're gonna be using Rubio Monaco today. I'm gonna go ahead and get it mixed up. We'll get it applied, and you can see for yourself just how beautiful this piece of wood is.
When I apply Rubio, I pour it directly on the workpiece, and then I use one of these 3M scrubbing pads. And I really like these because at this point, all you're really trying to do is work the Rubio into the fibers of the wood. And these are synthetic pads which don't absorb any of the product, and they just help you to spread it out. Then I'll let it sit for about 15 minutes before I come back and wipe it off until it is dry to the touch and I've removed all of the excess. And what's left behind is this beautiful warm color that you can see here.
Okay, well there you have it. You can see I barely mixed up any of this and I still have so much left over. Like I said, it's expensive stuff, but a little bit really does go a long way. I probably could have done 2 of these frames with that little bit that I mixed up. So what's really important with Rubio is that you just make sure that you wipe until it's dry. So I go around and I just keep wiping until there's no residue on the rag, and then I know that I'm good. And I know it's called Rubio Monaco, but I will return after about 24 hours, do a very light sanding and apply a second coat. I find that with walnut and some other hardwoods, it really needs that second coat, otherwise it looks kind of dull. And after that second coat, it really brings it to life. It gets that nice shine and makes sure that we're fully protected. So you don't need to see that. It's just going to be the same process all over. We'll pick this back up when we come time to mount the image. Okay, well I've got the print inside. I've dropped it into the frame. Now there's only a couple steps left to do to finish this piece of art. The first thing is I take tile spacers and I go all the way around the print because we're doing a float frame. That means that the leading edge of the print is visible, and I want to make sure it's completely parallel to the frame. So I left 1/8 of an inch all the way around my rabbet, making sure I'd be able to adjust a tiny bit. And that's what I'm doing is I'm going around. I took measurements all the way around the print. I need to be 1 3/8 from the edge of the walnut. Figured out where I might be off a little kilt, and then I'm putting in these 1/8 inch spacers to suck up the gap between the wood and the base, mount board, and then that's going to make sure that the print can't shift inside the frame and it'll always stay perfectly parallel. Now the other benefit of using these spacers is going to allow the frame to move. Wood naturally expands and contracts as the temperatures change, humidity levels change, and you don't want to jam a mounting board in there that's going to restrict that movement because it could lead to issues in the frame. So by leaving that 1/8 inch all the way around, it'll allow that frame to move freely, and then using these spacers will hold the print firmly intact. Then what I do is I go all the way around and I drive in framing points with my pneumatic point driver, and where I have those spacers specifically, I will drive a point into each corner and then I'll take a razor blade and cut off the top so that we have a nice flush top. So I'm just gonna add a few more driving points, and then we just have one more step until this is a finished piece. Okay, now that I have secured the print in place using the framing points, I like to apply a backer board, and this is really just strictly for aesthetics. I don't like the look of the framing points, and I just want to have a nice, clean, finished look on the back. So I've put down some Scotch double-sided acid-free tape using this Scotch gun, and then I just go all the way around, pressing down, and it's just going to give me a nice, smooth, clean finish with none of that hardware visible. Obviously, nobody really sees the back of the frame, but at some point they'll move, the print will move, and it just gives a professional finish to the image. Now, I have two more steps, and I'm going to fast forward through these because they're a little bit extra. I'm going to apply wall buddies to each corner. I have pre-drilled holes on my corners, so it's as simple as screwing these in. And then this print is right on that cusp of where I like to have a little bit of extra support. So I'm going to be putting an eye hook at the center of each of the long boards, and then I'm going to run a wire across. Now I'm just going to pull it to where it's just taut, so that if in the future that frame wants to sag, I highly doubt that'll ever happen, but if it does, that extra little bit of support in the middle is going to protect the frame from putting too much joint on those corners. So I'll put an eye hook here, a little bit of wire in between, and then that'll just be a little bit of extra insurance. But that's going to do it for me today. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know in the comments if you like the framing videos. We cover a lot on this channel, I know we do. But photography is a broad topic, and I enjoy all aspects of it, and I want to share that with you, and I hope you enjoy it as well. So let me know your thoughts. Other than that, I hope you have a fantastic weekend. Now get out there and make some images.